Welcome to RealClear Investigations Miller Report. I'm Maggie Miller. This week, Chairman Schmitt led his first hearing in the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, examining the role of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, in the censorship of Americans, despite receiving billions in federal taxpayer dollars and subsidies. Often referred to as the Censorship Industrial Complex, the discussion centered on what many see as a direct assault on our freedom of speech. While Chairman Schmitt and conservative committee members highlighted a long-standing issue exacerbated during President Biden's tenure, liberal committee members argue that the current administration is engaging in censorship on an unprecedented scale. Notably, both sides agreed that free speech is under attack. The key debate remains over who is responsible and what will be done moving forward. I've sat down with two of the journalists that were brought forward to deliver remarks at this subcommittee meeting: Mollie Hemingway, the editor-in-chief of the Federalist, and Ben Weingarten, an investigative journalist with RealClear Investigations, where he has written extensively on the censorship industrial complex. So you were brought before the Senate committee to speak as a victim, making the case that censorship industrial complex has tangibly hurt your business and your ability to share your work. One of the ways is through advertising starvation, where because of blacklists that you've been placed on, you aren't given money. When did you first notice this sort of censorship, and how has it affected your abilities as a journalist?
I think we first noticed that there was a censorship complex maybe around 2016 or shortly thereafter. That was the year when President Trump kind of surprised everybody by winning. Everyone said that there was no way he could win. And a lot of people came up with a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump had stolen the election by colluding with Russia. And so they wanted to shut down social media or greatly monitor social media or just look at how they could downplay certain stories or amplify others, cut off traffic to some stories, increase traffic to others. And so we started seeing it around then, but it really ramped up, I would say, in 2020, which was a combination of things. There was the COVID pandemic, where if you disagreed with what some federal agencies said about the proper response to the pandemic, you were ruthlessly censored. And then also there were the BLM riots and protests, where if you disagreed with that, we started seeing some major action taken against us at that time. And I just want to say it culminated in that fall with the Hunter Biden laptop story, where there was a whole project to get people to not treat that story like it was a real story. They prepped members of Congress and the media that a story like that might come out, and they said, if it does come out, you should probably censor it. And so it was like the really bad year for censorship.
Ben, you represent RealClearPolitics, which sits in one of the top spots on the GDI blacklist, a list that is used by many to determine advertising. Being on a list like this is a form of censorship, because instead of outright saying that you can't say something, they make it so that you can afford to keep people on staff, which then hurts the product. What is a company to do when in this position? And have you noticed this to be a problem?
Well, first of all, it's a great point, and the way you frame it is a shrewd way of doing so. These quote unquote risk raters, and that's GDI and NewsGuard primarily, it's sort of sinister that they have emerged in the first place, because while on their face, these organizations present themselves as trying to channel traffic and eyeballs and the American mind essentially towards publications that are credible, use good journalistic standards, etc. These entities are really the outgrowth of a quote unquote brand safety push. And my colleague at RealClear Investigations, Mark Hemmingway, has written, I think, brilliantly on this. But essentially, what brand safety says is, gee, you've got a great business there. It would be a shame if something happened to it because you're advertising near what we deem to be a toxic website. And if you advertise near what we deem to be a toxic website on social media or otherwise, the consequence is that progressive boycott groups, activist groups, agitators are going to try and destroy your business. So looking at it from 30,000 feet, it's hard to know if GDI and NewsGuard would exist were it not for the fact that there were progressive pressure campaigns under the guise of brand safety to try and potentially destroy companies who would dare to advertise near news outlets and opinion propagators that our political elites don't like. Now to level set into how it manifests itself, basically the explicit purpose of these sorts of risk rating vehicles is they want to quote unquote defund misinformation and disinformation as they define it. And as we know, oftentimes what that really amounts to is they want to characterize disfavored views as misdis or malinformation. And malinformation, by the way, is true information that leads someone to believe in a narrative that the powers that be don't like. And to your point, the blacklisting, which is really what it is, where they have these dynamic exclusion lists where they rate some sites as risky and then they whitelist other sites as highly credible. And then they shuttle these over to large brands and ad tech companies with the explicit purpose of getting them not to advertise on the bad websites, so-called, and to advertise on the good ones. And what's mind-blowing about the model is that RealClearPolitics has been targeted by both of these entities when the business model explicitly, the ethos, the mission is viewpoint diversity, to present the best of the left and the right and leave it to the American people who have agency. They don't need to be told what's good and what's not good, what's true and what's false, what opinions are legitimate and what opinions are illegitimate. They can make up their minds for themselves. That's how we view the American people. And I think there's an inherent contempt towards the American people among our elites who would say that we know best and it's our job to ensure that you consume a diet of media that we deem to be healthy. But I think just for having the gall to present both sides, RealClear as a brand has gotten dinged by these risk raters. And I think that speaks volumes about their mission. And at the end of the day, it does make business difficult because, and the explicit purpose of these entities is to deprive media outlets of revenue from advertising. And if you're not going to do that, then you need to look to other sources, including having to raise money potentially from donors. And it leads you to basically have to focus on non-core competencies potentially if you're in management in an organization, and to have to divert precious resources towards the fundraising that you wouldn't have had to do before. And the most nefarious part of this, and what I talked about in part in my written and spoken testimony, is the fact that taxpayer dollars have gone to these organizations, and that simply should not be the case. We could have a great debate about whether risk rating entities, so-called, should exist anyway in the marketplace, whether it's good for our body politic, whether it's good for the marketplace of ideas. And we can have a First Amendment conversation beyond. But the first thing is, and my view is, not a single penny of taxpayer dollars should go towards silencing ourselves or towards funding organizations that would silence entire outlets merely for deigning to think different or present both sides.
And so, have you noticed a change since the election or since the inauguration of President Trump this second time around, or does the market attitude remain unchanged?
Well, neither. I mean, there's a little bit of a change, but it's still a problem. So you started to see these big media oligarchs, these tech oligarchs say, oh, maybe we went too far when we censored everybody on the right and helped out the left. So we'll tamp it down just a little bit, which does not in any way mean A, that they are, or B, that it's anywhere near sufficient to correct what was done. I mean, Facebook throttled traffic for right of center publications for years. And they said, okay, so we'll give $1 million to Donald Trump's inauguration. Well, that doesn't really matter to publications. And it's also not that, it's not that impressive. And the censorship still goes on. And also it could easily come back. So something needs to be done to protect speech, and so that it's not at the whims of these, tech bros, whether or not we get to have free speech.
And so we're speaking after you delivered remarks at a subcommittee meeting. So what can Congress do to make sure that we have a 50-50 nation represented with viewpoint diversity?
Yeah. So the thing that's interesting about the censorship industrial complex is, first off, understanding how it operates. And so there are lots of ways that the government is involved in the censorship industrial complex. You have federal agencies that sometimes help promote or help develop censorship tools, blacklisting tools. They've given money to help start those companies or NGOs, or they give grants to academic institutions. So all of that should be shut off, and Congress could make sure that they understand they have the power of the purse, and so they could shut off that funding. There's ongoing promotion of these censorship and blacklisting tools and technology that take place at a number of agencies. They could make it illegal for the State Department or other agencies or departments to promote censorship tools. And and just understanding how much that NGO environment is part of this, I think would go a long way to helping stop some of the massive amount of funding.
And so you touched on it a little bit right there, but the government groups that are involved in this operation that almost in some cases may have acted as a piggy bank, what would you say to them?
Well, I mean, they did amazing work supporting the censorship of speech and debate among Americans. They have funded so many of these different entities, again, whether it's universities that have disinformation centers or think tanks or NGOs. It's so many different agencies within the government too, State Department, Homeland Security, Department of Justice, all of them, HHS, they're all involved in some way. And so it should be stopped. The other big concern, though, is because Americans have free speech rights, you're seeing foreign entities be used as a way to do a backdoor censorship of American speech. So the anti-speech community has figured out that if they can change laws in Europe or other parts of the world that force big tech companies to restrict speech for non-Americans, the tools that are put in place can also help restrict speech for Americans. And so I think the US government should be much more bold about fighting back against that international assault on speech, because it goes against Americans' free speech rights.
So where can we go from here? What can Congress do? What should be done?
Well, I laid it out in my testimony before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution. And I sort of asked a rhetorical question during the hearing, which is, would this censorship regime have been imposed, A, had Donald Trump not won the presidency in 2016, but B, had there not been federal funding, federal coordination, incubation, direction by way of these various national strategies that the administration put forth, like the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, which essentially made whole of society censorship a national security imperative and baked it into our policies. If you took the government out, would this whole regime exist? And I think the answer is no from its outset. Now, the challenge we're going to deal with going forward is it has been built up. The first step is starve it of government funding, government direction. And we shouldn't have to do this because the First Amendment should do its work on this issue by itself, but it obviously has not proven a barrier to those who would want to censor. So the first thing is, essentially, Congress ought to codify the Trump administration's first day executive order, which says that no one in the federal government can work on censorship matters. They can't outsource it either, so you can't censor directly or by proxy. You can't use government resources to do it. That really needs to be codified into law, in my view. Secondly, I would suggest that there need to be very severe penalties for federal officials who would dare violate those laws, because the only deterrent at the end of the day is going to be significant punishment. There's been legislation out there in the past Congress that would provide a private right of action, which would basically allow you, if you were censored by a government officer, to file suit against them. That certainly is probably one fruitful deterrent measure, and maybe easier to pass something like that in Congress than the more severe penalties that I would probably advocate for personally. And then beyond that, there needs to be substantial oversight into what happened with the non-governmental vehicles, because that is even more nefarious in some ways than government doing the censorship. It's almost an inadvertent admission of guilt that the government had to build up NGOs, fund think tanks, academic institutions, the risk raters, the fact checkers, and even for-profits. Because essentially what they did was they laundered the censorship activities through these outside actors. ultimately, the executive action that's being undertaken, the first day executive order, the State Department declaring very early on in its mission, it's not going to be in the business of targeting Americans' speech. The enforcement actions potentially being brought at FTC and FCC as well. All of these measures, I think, are very valuable and significant. And the administration also engaging in review of what the Biden administration did as well is hugely significant. The retroactive work to deter future behavior and expose it. But it has to be codified in law at the end of the day, or it may not outlast one administration. And that will be the challenge for Congress. And there's obviously a high bar in the Senate as well. So stay tuned, and we'll be reporting on all of this and much more related to the censorship industrial complex going forward. And I'll be testifying before a House committee on this very issue as well next week before the House Foreign Affairs Committee alongside Matt Taibbi, and we'll be talking about the State Department's role in these domestic censorship efforts.
And then it appears that there is a change of mind with some of these major social media companies who have been really directly involved in this. Obviously, the purchase of X by Elon, Meta supposedly having a change of mind. But has their behavior changed, and what can they do to actually walk that new walk?
I would say the only tech bro, I don't love that the country is seemingly like at the whims of tech oligarchs, but the only oligarch to have had any sort of free speech movement that he seems to really care about would be Elon Musk. He bought Twitter, he changed it to X. The speech restrictions have declined quite a bit on X. What you see with these other tech bro oligarch types is more that they claim that they're changing their viewpoint as opposed to actually seeing that change. For instance, there should be restitution for those companies that were harmed by Mark Zuckerberg's activism on behalf of the left, partly which he did through the funding of 2 NGOs that were involved in the 2020 election. He gave like $430 million to 2 NGOs that were involved in the private takeover of government election offices to help Democrats. But much more than that was the shuttering of any traffic whatsoever to news outlets that contradicted his preferred political narrative. And there has, to my knowledge, been no restitution for that, no attempt to make those people whole for what he did. And so when he says like, oh, I've changed my mind, I'm saying a few things that don't really matter. I mean, it's just nowhere near enough to make up for the damage that Facebook and Meta did. And likewise, Google continues to just absolutely shut down any traffic. I can look for an article I wrote under my name with a headline I wrote at my publication, The Federalist, and I can't find it on Google because that's how awful Google is at making sure that if people are looking for news and information or to get access to an ongoing debate, that they will not get good news and information from one side of the political debate.
Well, as we wrap things up, is there anything else you'd like to add? Obviously, this is an issue that is near and dear to you because it's obviously affected you, but anything you'd like to say moving forward?
Just that this attack on Americans' speech rights is the worst we've ever had in our country's history. And it's something that Americans really should know more about. It's an attack on the publications and the reporters who are doing this work, but it's an attack on Americans because if we don't have good news and information, we can't make good decisions. And so it's something that Americans should care much more about than we've seen in past years.
That was it for the Miller Report. We'll see you next time.